Russian officer refuses to salute Ibrahim Traoré. Putin's reaction shocks the world. The wind whipped across Red Square, chilling even the seasoned guards who stood rigid in their posts. Snow had begun to fall lightly, dusting the Kremlin's golden domes with a pale sheen. Moscow was still bustling with activity, though a noticeable hush had fallen over the city. Something big was happening. Whispers had spread like wildfire across diplomatic circles and government halls. A controversial African leader had arrived in Russia. But before we dive into what happens next, I'd love to know, where are you tuning in from today? Drop a comment below, and please like the video. Thank you. President Ibrahim Traoré of Burkina Faso, a former military officer turned revolutionary, had become one of the most talked about figures in Africa. His rise to power had been rapid and unapologetic, and his unapologetic stance against Western exploitation had earned him both enemies and fierce admiration. A staunch critic of neo-colonialism, Traoré had cut several ties with France, sought new alliances, and was now seen as a bold symbol of African resistance. His visit to Moscow was more than symbolic. It was strategic. President Vladimir Putin, himself a master of symbolism, had arranged a highly public welcoming ceremony. Cameras from all major Russian networks lined the square, along with international press. The world watched. Every frame mattered. Every gesture would be dissected. Traoré emerged from his armored vehicle in a black overcoat, gold trim glinting subtly in the weak winter sunlight. His presence was commanding. He walked with deliberate calmness, flanked by his own detail, stoic men in dark uniforms, eyes scanning constantly. Traoré's posture was straight, his expression unreadable. But to the edge of the red carpet leading into the Kremlin stood the honor guard, elite soldiers trained for precision and protocol. Among them was Captain Mikhail Orlov, a veteran of the Russian armed forces. Orlov was known for his discipline, his unshakable adherence to tradition, and though less openly, his deep-seated views on race and status. As Traoré approached, the line of soldiers saluted in unison. All but one. Orlov stood stiff, his arms by his side, eyes hard and unblinking. He did not raise his hand at T first. It seemed like a momentary lapse, a delay in reflex. But as the camera zoomed in, it became obvious he had refused. Deliberately. His face said it all. Disdain, Traoré noticed. Of course he did. But he said nothing. He didn't even pause. His stride did not falter as he passed the soldier who had chosen to dishonor him. His silence was thunderous. Putin, standing at the top of the steps, caught it too. His trained eyes missed nothing. As Traoré reached him, Putin extended his hand and gave a respectful nod. The two men clasped hands in a firm grip, holding eye contact for a long moment. Neither smiled. This wasn't a friendly meeting. It was an alliance built on mutual benefit and a shared opposition to the West's dominance. The ceremony continued. Flags waved, bands played. But the tension had already been captured in a single moment. By the time the two presidents entered the Kremlin, the footage of Orlov's refusal had gone viral. Social media exploded. In Africa, outrage. In Europe and America, both curiosity and smugness. In Russia, confusion. For Captain Orlov, however, the consequences were still unknown. That evening, inside the Kremlin's most private conference room, Putin's advisors debated the incident. Some brushed it off as a minor protocol failure. Others, especially the intelligence chiefs, argued that the optics could not be ignored. Putin listened in silence, drumming his fingers on the polished table. When the room quieted, he spoke. "Do you know why Traoré came to Moscow?" he asked, voice calm but sharp. No one answered. He came because he no longer trusts the West. He came because Russia represents power to him, an ally not afraid to stand against colonial remnants. We offer him weapons, infrastructure, support, and in return, we gain influence over an entire region. Strategic minds, UN votes, new military bases. He leaned forward, and yet, one man, one soldier, decided his opinion of the color of someone's skin was more important than the interests of the Russian Federation. Silence. "I want him brought to me. Tonight." Orlov was taken into custody without ceremony. Two internal agents appeared at his barracks, and quietly escorted him to a black vehicle. He didn't resist. Perhaps he believed he had acted out of patriotic purity. Perhaps he believed he had done the right thing. But deep down, he knew the Russian machine didn't tolerate disruptions. He was led through a private entrance beneath the Kremlin and brought into a small, dimly lit room. There, sitting at a lone table, was President Putin himself. No guards, no assistants, just the leader of Russia, waiting. "Sit," Putin said. Orlov obeyed, standing straight like the soldier he was, but there was no hiding the tremor in his hands. "You refuse to salute a foreign head of state during an official ceremony," Putin began. "Explain." Orlov's jaw clenched. "He is not a leader worthy of Russian respect, sir. Because he is a dictator. Because he is not our equal. Because he—" Putin interrupted him with a quiet wave of his hand. "No. Say what you mean. You looked at his skin and saw inferiority. Say it." Orlov froze. He didn't speak. Putin stood slowly, walking around the table until he stood behind the captain. "In Africa," he said, "Traore is seen as a liberator, a lion among men. And in refusing to salute him, you insulted not just him, but his people, his nation. You made a mockery of Russian diplomacy. You shamed your uniform." Orlov opened his mouth, but no words came. "You think you're better than him?" Putin said, stepping closer. "Traore took power with his own hands, commands armies, builds alliances. He walks into our capital and negotiates on equal terms. You disobeyed a protocol because of a pigment, because of a prejudice." The silence stretched. "Do you think I care about your beliefs? Your feelings?" Putin's voice turned icy. "In my Russia, you are either useful or you are nothing." Without warning, Putin raised a hand. 2 agents entered. "Strip him of rank, dishonorable discharge, and send him where he'll learn humility." Orlov's protests were silenced as he was dragged from the room. His uniform was torn from his chest before he even made it down the hall. The next morning, Russian state television announced that Captain Mikhail Orlov had been dismissed from service for violating military protocol during an official diplomatic event. The Kremlin released a carefully worded statement affirming Russia's commitment to international respect, equality, and partnership. But that wasn't all. 2 days later, a quiet but shocking development surfaced. Orlov had been sent to a remote military outpost in Siberia, not as an officer, as a laborer, stripped of his rank, privileges, and pension. The punishment sent ripples through the military. Racism would not be tolerated, not even in whispers. Meanwhile, President Traore extended his visit. What was supposed to be a 24-hour diplomatic exchange became a 4-day negotiation. He was given a personal tour of Russia's newest defense systems. Trade agreements were signed. Russia agreed to invest heavily in Burkina Faso's infrastructure and mining sectors. In return, Traore granted access to rare minerals and allowed a joint military base to be constructed in Ouagadougou. When Traore finally left Moscow, he did so in a Russian jet, escorted by a flight wing, a gesture typically reserved for allies of the highest order. The message was clear: Russia stood with Africa's rising powers, and any insult to their leaders was an insult to Moscow itself. The footage of Orlov's refusal remained on the internet, but it now served as a cautionary tale. Commentators around the world dissected the story. African news outlets hailed Putin as a rare world leader who had stood firmly against racial arrogance. In Europe, opinions were mixed, but no one doubted the symbolism. Putin had used the moment to cement an alliance and crush internal dissent in one stroke. As for Orlov, no interviews were ever granted. Rumors swirled about his fate. Some said he had been sent to a penal camp, others that he had vanished entirely. The Kremlin offered no comment, but those close to power understood what had happened. Putin had acted not out of morality, but out of calculation. His reaction had shocked the world, not because it was righteous, but because it was effective. The Russian bear had defended the African lion, not out of love, but because the alliance made them both more dangerous. And in the cold wind of Red Square, the snow kept falling, slowly burying the footprints of pride, prejudice, and power, of course. Here's the continuation of the story, heightening the stakes and making the arc more epic. Months passed. The world watched as a quiet, seismic shift unfolded beneath the surface of global politics. Traoré's Moscow visit became a lightning rod for international debate, but the real impact was felt in the months that followed. When alliances began to tilt, weapons shipments began to move, and Africa, once fractured by colonial borders and exploited resources, began to unify under a new doctrine. They called it the Ouagadougou Doctrine, and its author was none other than Ibrahim Traoré. The doctrine was bold. Any aggression from foreign power toward one African state would be met with retaliation from all signatory states. Economic blockades against African nations would be responded to with embargoes of rare earth minerals. It was in essence a declaration of independence, not just from colonial history, but from the modern mechanisms of control. And Russia, under Putin's icy blessing, was the first to back it. Moscow began funneling advanced weaponry, hypersonic drones, electronic warfare systems, and defensive radars into Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger. The West, particularly France and the United States, raised alarms at the UN, but they were too slow. The African alliance, newly armed and newly united, moved fast in the West African deserts. Russian and African troops trained side by side. Satellite images showed underground facilities being constructed. Command centers, bunkers, airfields, some bearing the unmistakable architecture of Russian military engineering. At the heart of it all was Traoré. But something else began to stir that on a freezing Siberian night, deep in a prison labor camp buried beneath permafrost and silence, Mikhail Orlov stood under the gaze of the aurora borealis. His face had aged rapidly, beard wild, eyes haunted. He worked 12 hours a day, hauling supplies for mining operations, slept in frost-covered barracks, and ate only enough to stay upright. But he survived, and in that silence, hate began to bloom. Orlov wasn't dead, and though the Kremlin had buried him in Siberia to make a point, they had also underestimated his resilience. Around him, whispers started. Other soldiers disgraced for dissent, old nationalists furious at Russia's pivot to what they saw as foreign entanglements. In their eyes, the alliance with Traoré wasn't strategy. It was betrayal. Orlov, broken but alive, began to speak. What started as muttered frustrations around a dying fire turned into secret meetings, smuggled messages, and eventually a cell. A brotherhood of disillusioned soldiers, former FSB operatives, and old guard ideologues who believed Russia had lost its way. They called themselves Rodina Porga, Motherland Storm, and they wanted vengeance. Word of their existence reached Moscow within weeks, but by then it was too late. They had embedded in certain outposts, infiltrated underfunded regional garrisons, and most dangerously, made contact with anti-government forces abroad. In Paris, in Berlin, even in Washington, whispers began. Could this group be used to fracture the Russia-Africa alliance? While Putin dealt with a quiet rebellion at home, Traoré rose on the international stage. He stood before the African Union in Addis Ababa and declared, "We do not beg for dignity. We enforce it. If the world does not give us a seat at the table, we will build our own table, then burn theirs." His words echoed far beyond Africa. In the Caribbean, in parts of South America, even in Southeast Asia, leaders began to echo his tone. He had become not just a president, but a symbol, a dark horse of global reformation. The Black Lion of Africa, they called him. But symbols breed enemies. One morning in Moscow, just as the snow began to melt into slush, a bomb detonated near the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Know this, just shattered glass and smoke. A warning. The attackers left a flag behind, black, red, and white, Rodina Porga's colors. That same week, a convoy of Russian advisors traveling through Burkina Faso was ambushed. Though the attackers were masked, investigators found Western equipment, American satellite uplinks, NATO standard explosives. The alliance was under siege from both within and without. Putin summoned Traoré again, not for ceremony, but for war council. This time, they met not in the Kremlin, but in an underground command facility beneath the Ural Mountains. The Russian president, flanked by generals, Welcome Traore like a brother. No pretense, no flux, just strategy. I underestimated Orlov, Putin admitted, voice a low growl. He's more than a racist coward now. He's a symbol for those who want the world to stay how it was. You and I represent a new world order. Traore, seated in combat gear, nodded slowly. Then let's build that order and crush the old. Together, they launched Operation Severbobab, a joint initiative to destroy Radina Porga cells and expose their Western backers. Russian intelligence infiltrated dark web forums. African operatives tracked foreign agents through West African jungles. Drones patrolled the Sahel. Disinformation flooded Western media, making it impossible to know who was winning. But behind every maneuver was one goal: find Orlov and end him. The search led to the Arctic. A decommissioned Soviet submarine silo, long abandoned, had been reactivated by Porga forces. There, in the ice-blasted wasteland, the final act unfolded. Traore insisted on leading the African special unit that would breach the silo. He wanted Orlov to see his face, not as a diplomat in a suit, but as a soldier. The same kind of soldier Orlov had once disrespected. But now, one armed with global power, they descended into the tunnels at dawn. Gunfire echoed, steel clanged. Russian Spetsnaz fought shoulder to shoulder with Burkinabe commandos. Orlov, wounded, tried to escape through an emergency shaft. But Traore caught him in the snow. They stood face to face once more, Traore in black armor, Orlov bleeding, gasping, the last snow of the Arctic swirling around them. "You should have saluted," Traore said quietly. Orlov spat blood into the snow. "You don't deserve it." Traore didn't reply. He raised his sidearm, and with one cold shot, ended a ghost that had haunted the future. The world would never see the footage. The Kremlin buried the operation. Officially, Orlov died in a failed escape from a military tribunal. But among the elite circles, the story spread. The Black Lion had hunted his enemy to the ends of the earth, and Putin had led him. Months later, Traore stood at the opening ceremony of the Pan-African Defense Coalition headquarters in Bamako. Behind him, flags from over 30 African nations waved. In his speech, he said, "A salute is not a gesture. It is an acknowledgement. We salute not just uniforms, but history, sacrifice, and vision. We salute those who build the future." He paused. "And to those who cling to the past, we offer no hand, only silence or steel." Across the world, governments took notice. The old order had cracked, and in the East and South, the lion and the bear watched the world reshuffle, with patient eyes and iron claws, certainly. Here is the continued story, building on the epic scale and deepening the geopolitical and personal stakes. Years passed. The world had changed. Africa, once seen as a chessboard for great powers, had become a power in its own right. The Pan-African Defense Coalition, PAC, forged in war and defiance, had become more than a military pact. It was now a continental superstructure, a fusion of intelligence networks, research programs, and economic solidarity. And at its center stood Ibrahim Traoré, the man who had once walked silently past a disrespectful salute in Moscow and turned it into a turning point in world history. Why now? His name had become legend. Schools across the African continent taught of the Siberian encounter, where Traoré hunted down Mikhail Orlov in the frozen white silence, avenging not only an insult, but centuries of humiliation. Statues of the Black Lion stood in capital cities. His speeches were etched into marble, and even his critics, those wary of his growing authority, could not deny the tectonic shifts he had triggered. But every lion draws challengers. Inside Western capitals, a new doctrine had formed, covert, deniable, and ruthless. The Containment and Disruption Initiative, CDI, spearheaded by a joint US-UK-French clandestine unit, was tasked with one goal: break the Russia-Africa axis. They couldn't fight it openly. The pact had nuclear protection clauses now, shielded by Russia's strategic umbrella and in some whispered corners by China as well. But war didn't always need missiles. It needed ghosts. The CDI's first act was surgical, silence African scientists working on satellite defense systems. Two disappeared in Dakar. A third's car exploded in Kampala. A cybersecurity expert in Lagos died of a heart attack at 36. All unclaimed, all obvious, but the PAD responded. Traore, hardened by years of betrayal, now oversaw a Black Ops intelligence unit known as the Mbembe Circle, named after the mythical, unseen river beast of Central Africa. These operatives didn't arrest. They didn't interrogate. They erased. And in Berlin, one night, a high-ranking CDI strategist vanished from his penthouse suite, his security staff found tranquilized. A note left behind, handwritten in French. We remember everything. The message was received. The shadow war escalated. Meanwhile, Russia reveled in the chaos. Putin, older but still ruthlessly calculating, had taken a more symbolic role but wielded influence through a new generation of nationalist technocrats. They called him the Founding Flame, and his legacy was tightly bound to the African alliance. Traore had become both protege and peer. The two spoke weekly, encrypted line, no intermediaries, but inside the Kremlin, something simmered. One man, Sergei Myrov, rose quietly through the Ministry of Defense. A brilliant tactician with deep FSB roots and a cold disdain for diplomacy, Myrov believed Putin had gone soft. He saw Africa not as an ally, but as a tool, and he resented how much power Traore now held, not only globally, but within Moscow's own halls. Whispers emerged, a new doctrine, one that believed the Russian bear should no longer share the hunt, but lead it. Myrov had loyalists, some from old Spetsnaz units, some from deep inside Russian cyber command. And soon, he reached out to a familiar name, thought dead and buried, Radina Porga. The remnants of Orlov's ideology still lived, scattered, hunted but not broken. In Eastern Europe, in dark web conclaves, in frozen prisons where influence still lingered, Myrov offered them something Orlov never could: state backing. Their goal would be the same: bring down the lion. But not through bullets, not through bombs, through betrayal. In 2032, a shock rippled through global news networks. A leak. Hundreds of encrypted files dumped onto the darknet, alleging secret war crimes committed by PAC units. False at first glance, but laced with real images, forged testimonies, and manipulated metadata. Enough to spark doubt. The world hesitated. The African Union demanded investigation. Western media exploded. Protests ignited in South Africa and Kenya. Traore's image, once untouchable, was painted on walls with the word tyrant scrawled beneath it. Inside his presidential compound in Ouagadougou, Traore stared at the leak. He didn't blink. He had long known this day would come. Not from the West, but from inside Russia that he called Putin. The voice on the other end was strained, older, but calm. I didn't authorize this, Putin said, but I knew it might come. Then the alliance is dead. Traore asked. No, Putin said, but soon I will be. There was a pause, a heavy silence between two men who had reshaped the world. I won't let it end like this, Traore said. He activated Protocol Zulu, a contingency known only to a dozen individuals, a counterstrike of truth. Hidden archives of Western meddling in African elections, footage of illegal arms transfers, Teyatapes, European bribery trails, all stored in a quantum-encrypted database buried beneath Mount Cameroon. And then he did the unthinkable that he flew to Moscow alone in a convoy. No press, just a flight at midnight. By the time Russian intelligence knew, his plane had already crossed their skies. He landed in the dark, an old Soviet airbase. Waiting for him was Myrov, not Putin. You shouldn't have come, Myrov said, his voice slick as oil. I came to see the empire you're trying to steal, Traore replied. Myrov laughed. You think you matter without Putin? You're a puppet wrapped in myth. Traore stepped close. No, I'm a myth that kills kings. A scuffle erupted. Gunfire. But Traore wasn't alone. From the shadows, Mbembe operatives emerged, silent, masked. Myrov's men fell. The general himself was taken alive, dragged into the ice. His last words were spit in Russian. "You'll never own us." Traore looked down at him. "I don't need to own you. I just need you out of the way." By dawn, the Kremlin announced a quiet transition of power. Putin had passed in his sleep. The new government reaffirmed ties with the pack, denounced Meyer's actions, and purged the military. The leak was discredited, partly, but the damage had been contained, and the world saw something terrifying. Ibrahim Traoré had flown into the heart of Russia, faced down a coup, and emerged more powerful than ever. And no African leader had ever done such a thing. No one, in decades, had treated Moscow as an equal, let alone as a subordinate partner. The age of empires had shifted. Now, students in Shanghai studied the African Renaissance doctrine. Brazilian engineers collaborated with Ghanaian inventors. The IMF and World Bank faced extinction as a new Pan-South economic bloc emerged, backed by blockchain currencies and resource-backed bonds. Traoré had not only survived the storm, he had become it. And in a private moment, years later, standing alone at the edge of the Sahara, watching the stars swirl in silence, he whispered into the wind, "You should have saluted." The wind did not answer, but the world had already bowed.